Imagine, like just for a second, you're one of the most celebrated artists in your entire country.
Right.
I mean, your work is globally recognized. You are a complete cultural icon. But instead of sleeping in your nice warm bed,
Yeah.
you spend your nights sitting wide awake on the cold landing outside your apartment.
Wow. Yeah. Just sitting in the dark.
Right. Sitting right next to the elevator.
Just listening to the mechanical gears of the lift, waiting for them to just grind to a halt on your floor.
Exactly. Because you are sitting by that elevator knowing the secret police are coming to arrest you.
Yeah.
And you figure, well, if you wait out in the hall, when the men in the leather coats finally do show up, at least they won't wake your sleeping family. You can just, step into the elevator and vanish quietly.
It is a profoundly chilling image. I mean, the absolute paralyzing terror of the Great Purge's midnight knock on the door, it's all distilled into this quiet, desperate act of a father trying to protect his kids.
Just trying to save them the trauma of seeing him taken away. Well, today we are doing a deep dive into the life of Dmitri Shostakovich.
Yes.
He was a Soviet-era musical genius, right? A composer whose entire life was just this unimaginable high-wire act between international acclaim and, well, totalitarian terror.
Right. And our mission today is to explore how a creative mind survives that, how it adapts, and how it manages to speak the truth when literally every single note you write could be a death sentence.
Yeah.
We are going to trace Shostakovich's life through the turning points of his music, his terrifying run-ins with the state, and the covert codes he embedded deep within his symphony.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand the sheer terrifying drop of the fall he would eventually take, we first had to establish how meteorically he rose to prominence.
Right, because the higher you fly in a totalitarian state, the deadlier the target on your back becomes.
Exactly. How does someone end up being simultaneously the state's prize jewel and its biggest target?
Well, to see that initial rise, we go back to St. Petersburg. He was born there in 1906, and it became clear very early on that he wasn't just talented.
Right.
He was a prodigy with a freakish musical memory. Like, he started piano lessons with his mother at age 9, and she would put sheet music in front of him, and he would pretend to read it.
Wait, pretend?
Yeah. She eventually caught on that he wasn't reading the notes at all. He was simply reproducing the entire lesson from memory after hearing it just once.
Oh, wow. That is wild.
Yeah. And that kind of genius tracks straight into his formal education.
I mean, at the age of 19, as his graduation piece for the Petrograd Conservatory, he writes his first symphony. Most 19-year-olds are, struggling to figure out their place in the world.
Right.
And he delivers a symphony that becomes an overnight global sensation.
Yeah, the premiere in 1926 was received with such overwhelming enthusiasm that the audience demanded an encore of the scherzo.
That's the fast, wildly energetic second movement.
Exactly. Right then and there, they stopped the performance just to hear it again. And the acclaim didn't just stay confined to Russia.
Right. The legendary conductor Bruno Walter was so impressed he took the score and conducted it in Berlin.
And soon after, Leopold Stokowski led the American premiere in Philadelphia. I mean, before he was barely out of his teens, Shostakovich was a major international figure.
And he wasn't just a composer sitting at a desk, right?
Yeah.
He was a fiercely dedicated performing pianist.
Yes.
There is this deeply telling story from 1927 that just highlights his relentless discipline. He travels to Warsaw for the inaugural International Chopin Piano Competition.
Right.
And he is competing while literally recovering from appendicitis. In fact, he had his appendix removed midway through the competition period.
I mean, contemporaries noted how he would lock himself away to practice for weeks, completely ignoring the pain, ignoring his health.
Just utterly consumed by the preparation. It is like trying to win an Olympic sprint while passing a kidney stone.
That is a very accurate comparison.
He didn't end up taking the top prize, did he?
No, he didn't. He received an honorary diploma, and a pianist named Lev Oberin won. But that competition cemented a very specific playing style that would define him.
Yeah, critics called his approach anti-sentimental.
Right. He completely rejected extreme dynamic contrasts or, exaggerated weepy emotion. His playing was profound, highly rhythmic, and totally lacking in cheap, salon-like mannerisms.
And that anti-sentimental quality, that sharp, almost biting clarity that became the hallmark of his early compositions, too.
Yes, it did. But all of this early success merely set the stage for the moment the trapdoor opened beneath him.
Right. Fast forward to the 1930s. He has written a satiric, wildly successful opera called Lady Macbeth of the Medsensk district. It is playing to packed houses, praised by Soviet critics as a complete triumph of communist art until the fateful night of January 26, 1936.
Yeah, Joseph Stalin himself shows up at the opera.
Just sitting hidden behind a curtain in the government box with his entourage. I mean, the temperature of that theater must have plummeted the moment people realized who was actually there.
Oh, absolutely. Stalin watches the performance, and then he and his inner circle simply stand up and leave, without speaking a single word to anyone. And Shostakovich had actually been warned by a friend to delay a trip just to make sure he was in the theater for that specific performance. So he knew Stalin was there.
Oh, man.
Eyewitnesses reported that when Shostakovich went out to take his bow after the third act, just as the government box emptied out, he was white as a sheet. He understood immediately what that silence meant.
And 2 days later, the state newspaper, Pravda, drops the hammer. They publish an unsigned editorial titled, "Muddle Instead of Music."
Right.
And we need to be really clear about what Pravda was for you listening. This wasn't a snarky review from a theater critic.
Yeah, not at all.
This was the voice of the absolute state. They called his opera a deliberately dissonant, muddled stream of sounds that quacks, hoots, pants, and gasps.
What's fascinating here is the immediate, devastating, real-world impact of those words. It cannot be overstated. In the Soviet Union under Stalin, an editorial in Pravda was an official directive.
Right. Almost overnight, his commissions completely vanish.
Yeah, his income plummets from a comfortable average of 12,000 rubles a month to as little as 2,000.
Which brings up a fascinating question about totalitarianism itself.
Mm-hmm.
Like, why does a dictator with absolute military and political power care so deeply about a night at the opera?
That is the big question.
It really comes down to the control of meaning, doesn't it?
Mm.
Dictatorships rely on a completely unified, state-approved reality.
Right.
If a piece of music is abstract or complex or emotionally ambiguous, the state cannot control how the audience interprets it.
Mm.
And that loss of control is terrifying to an authoritarian regime.
That is the absolute core of it. The state demanded art that was simplistic, optimistic, and easily digestible as propaganda. Shostakovich's complex psychological opera was a direct threat to that enforced simplicity.
Yeah.
And the cultural isolation that followed the article was brutal. Critics who had spent the last 2 years praising the opera were suddenly forced to publicly recant in print,
Claiming they had somehow failed to detect the severe ideological shortcomings that Pravda pointed out. I mean, we think of a bad review today as something that might, ruin an artist's weekend. A bad review from Stalin in 1936 could ruin your life. Literally.
Oh, yeah, because 1936 isn't just the year of this editorial. It marks the escalation of the Great Purge.
Right. We are talking about a historical moment where his friends, his colleagues, and his family members are disappearing into the night, executed or shipped off to the gulag.
The sheer volume of loss he endured during this period is staggering. His close friend, Marshal Tukhachevsky, was executed.
God.
His mother-in-law, a brilliant astronomer, was arrested and sent to a labor camp in Karaganda. His brother-in-law, his uncle, and several esteemed colleagues like the Marxist writer Galina Serebryakova and the musicologist Nikolai Zhilyaev, all of them were killed or imprisoned for decades.
So the threat of the midnight knock wasn't just some paranoid fantasy. It was an immediate, bloody reality happening to everyone he loved.
Exactly. And at this exact moment, Shostakovich is in the middle of rehearsing his incredibly experimental Fourth Symphony.
And this piece was heavily influenced by Mahler, right? It was massive, shrieking, dissonant, and completely out of step with the simplistic optimism the state was now violently demanding.
Right. So he is forced to make a harrowing survival calculation. Right in the middle of rehearsals, he withdraws the Fourth Symphony.
Wow.
The manager of the Leningrad Philharmonic actually urged him to do it, knowing the music would likely get them both killed.
I mean, that symphony wouldn't be premiered until 1961, decades later.
Decades, yeah. Instead, Shostakovich pivots. He sits down and writes his Fifth Symphony in 1937.
Okay, wait, I have to ask. So he just caved? I mean, he wrote a state-approved propaganda piece just to save his own skin.
Well, if we look at it purely on the surface, it seems like he did. Officially, an article published under his name called The Fifth Symphony, a Soviet artist's creative response to just criticism.
Right. And musically, it was more conservative, structured much more traditionally than his previous work.
Yeah. The government authorities heard the triumphant-sounding finale and absolutely loved it. They claimed he had learned from his mistakes and become a true Soviet artist.
But that was just the official narrative, right?
Exactly. The true genius of the Fifth Symphony lies in its duality.
Because if he is surviving a horrific purge, he can't just write a happy communist march. It would completely betray everything he and his countrymen were enduring. He must have found a way to hide his grief inside that approved format.
He absolutely did. The nuance of the Fifth Symphony is found in its reception by the people, not the politicians.
Yeah.
At the premiere in Leningrad, the public openly wept. The emotion in the concert hall was just overwhelming.
Wow.
According to Shostakovich's disputed memoir, Testimony, he later reflected on that night, saying he would never believe that a man who understood nothing could feel the Fifth Symphony. Of course the audience understood. They understood exactly what the Fifth was mourning.
I mean, just put yourself in those theater seats in Leningrad in 1937. You know people who have disappeared. Your family members have been taken. You live in a society where you cannot even say their names out loud without risking your own life. And suddenly, a massive orchestra plays the exact agonizing grief you are feeling, but cannot express.
Yeah. It wasn't a surrender to the state. It was a Trojan horse. He was writing the tragedy of the Great Purge directly into the music, dressing it up in a classical format the censors would technically accept.
So he basically forged a profound language of double meaning.
Yes, and the gamble worked. The massive public and critical success of the Fifth Symphony essentially rehabilitated him. It put him back in the state's good graces and secured him a teaching position at the Leningrad Conservatory.
He'd cracked the code of surviving Stalin.
He had. But the tragic irony of Shostakovich's life is that just as he figures out the survival code for Stalin's terror, a completely different kind of terror arrives at his doorstep.
Right. In 1941, Adolf Hitler breaks his pact with Stalin, and Nazi Germany invades the Soviet Union.
And Shostakovich is living in Leningrad when the invasion begins. He initially tries to enlist in the military to fight, but he is turned away because of his notoriously poor eyesight.
But he refuses to sit idly by, right? He compensates by becoming a volunteer firefighter for the Conservatory's air raid brigade.
Yes.
There is that iconic photograph from 1941 of him in his heavy firefighter's helmet, standing on the roof of the conservatory, looking out over the city.
I know the one. That image was published in newspapers across the entire country.
I mean, in the span of a few years, he goes from being a disgraced, formalist enemy of the people to the literal poster boy for Soviet defiance against fascism.
It's incredible, and his creative contribution to the war effort was even more monumental. The Seventh Symphony, famously known as the Leningrad Symphony.
Right.
He wrote the first three movements while the city was actively under brutal siege by the Nazis, before he was finally evacuated to Kubyshev. He explicitly stated it was a symphony about our sacred war and our victory.
The story of how this symphony was performed back in Leningrad in August 1942 is just one of the most unbelievable moments in musical history.
Oh, absolutely.
The city is still enduring a suffocating, starving siege. The local radio orchestra has only 14 original musicians left alive and physically able to play.
Yeah. The conductor, Karl Eliasberg, literally had to go on the radio and recruit anyone left in the starving city who could hold an instrument just to field an orchestra.
And the musicians were severely malnourished. People were dropping dead on the streets from starvation.
But they rehearsed and they performed this massive, defiant, hour-long symphony. The military even set up loudspeakers.
Right, and the music was broadcast not only across the entire city to rally the citizens, but outwards toward the German front lines as a form of psychological warfare.
It became an instant piece of global anti-fascist propaganda, performed in London and the United States almost immediately to drum up support for the war effort.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting. You would naturally assume that after the war, his status is permanently secured. He is a war hero, a global symbol of resistance.
You'd think so, yes.
As the war is ending and victory is at hand, the Soviet authorities expect a grandiose, triumphant Ninth Symphony. They want a massive choral tribute to Stalin's glorious victory.
Something to rival Beethoven's Ninth.
Exactly. And he even fed into that expectation, didn't he?
He did. He told his students in early 1945 that he was working on a piece that was majestic in scale.
But he abandons that entirely. Instead, in the summer of 1945, he presents the actual Ninth Symphony, and it is shockingly short.
It is light, it is cheeky, playful, and incredibly sarcastic. There is no chorus, no bombast, no grand tribute to the dictator at all.
The authorities must have been absolutely furious.
Oh, they were? Soviet critics demanded to know why he was expressing feelings about the monumental defeat of Nazism in such a childish manner, as one paper put it.
Right, because the lightness of the symphony completely undercut the heavy, triumphant narrative Stalin demanded for his own glorification.
Exactly. Which leads directly to his second massive fall from grace. In 1948, Andrei Zhdanov, a top Soviet official, issues a sweeping decree.
The Zhdanov decree, right?
Yes. He denounces a whole group of prominent composers, including Shostakovich, Prokofiev, and Khachaturian, for writing what they called inappropriate and formalist music.
And we should clarify what formalism actually meant in this context, because it wasn't really a debate about musical theory, was it?
No, not at all. To Stalin's regime, formalism was a catch-all death sentence for music that was too complex, too abstract, or focused on aesthetics, rather than delivering a clear, state-approved, optimistic message to the working class.
It basically meant your music was dangerously Western and anti-Soviet.
Right. And this decree kicked off a terrifying campaign to root out Western influence. Shostakovich and his peers were summoned before tribunals to make humiliating, forced public apologies.
He was summarily fired from his professorship at the conservatory. His family immediately lost their state privileges, and most of his works were banned from being performed entirely.
This is the era we talked about at the very beginning, when he is waiting by the elevator at night in the dark.
Yeah.
To pay his rent and feed his family, he is forced to write generic film scores, which he considered hack work. Meanwhile, he hides his real serious compositions like his first violin concerto and the deeply personal song cycle from Jewish folk poetry literally in his desk drawer.
He doesn't dare show them to anyone, knowing discovery could mean the gulag.
Exactly.
The psychological toll of that internal exile was just immense, and the regime went out of its way to compound it with international humiliation.
Yeah.
In 1949, Stalin decided the Soviets needed prominent artistic representatives at a cultural and scientific conference for world peace in New York City, and he personally ordered Shostakovich to go.
And the story of that New York trip exposes the brutal disconnect between the free world and the reality of life under Stalin's terror.
Tell us about the Waldorf Astoria.
So, Shostakovich is standing at a press conference at the Waldorf Astoria, visibly terrified. An American composer named Nicholas Nabokov, who was secretly funded by the CIA, by the way, decides to publicly corner him.
Wow.
Nabokov asks Shostakovich in front of the world press if he personally supports the recent Soviet newspaper articles denouncing the music of Igor Stravinsky.
And Stravinsky was a composer Shostakovich absolutely worshipped. It was his musical idol.
Yes. Shostakovich, reading from a prepared script in a shaking, nervous voice, is forced to answer yes. He has to publicly agree with the denunciation of his hero. Nabokov later wrote about this incident as proof that Shostakovich was an obedient, cowardly tool of the Soviet government.
I mean, the cruelty of that moment is just hard to swallow. Nabokov and these Western observers completely failed to grasp the reality of the situation.
Completely.
Shostakovich literally had a metaphorical gun to his head. If he'd offended Stravinsky in New York, what would happen to his wife and children back in Moscow?
Yeah.
He was protecting his family's lives with that yes.
He survived the trip, but at the cost of his public dignity. He never forgave Nabokov for doing that to him.
No, I wouldn't either. But eventually, the landscape shifts. Stalin dies in 1953.
Right.
This brings a massive sigh of relief across the Soviet Union, initiating a cultural thaw under the new leader, Nikita Khrushchev. But strangely, his darkest personal moment actually comes during the supposedly softer era, well after Stalin's death.
Yeah, it's so counterintuitive. In 1960, the Khrushchev government wants to appoint Shostakovich as the chairman of the Russian Union of Composers.
Because Khrushchev was actively trying to co-opt the intelligentsia to legitimize his regime, right?
Exactly. But there was a non-negotiable catch. To hold that high-ranking position, Shostakovich had to finally officially join the Communist Party.
Wow, that was the one line he had refused to cross his entire life. Under the absolute worst of Stalin's terror, he managed to avoid joining the party.
Yep.
But now, without the threat of a firing squad, they essentially blackmail him into it.
And for Shostakovich, agreeing to sign that party card was the ultimate moral surrender. His son Maxim recalled that the decision reduced his father to hysterical tears.
God.
He told his wife he had been blackmailed. His close friend Lev Lebedinsky stated that the composer was openly suicidal during this period, feeling he had finally betrayed his own soul.
And out of this profound suicidal despair, he travels to Dresden and writes the 8th String Quartet. He composes the entire piece in just 3 days in 1960.
Right. And the official Soviet dedication of the quartet was to the victims of fascism and war, ostensibly remembering the Allied bombing of Dresden, but those closest to him knew the truth.
Yeah.
Shostakovich confessed in a letter to a friend, stating he started thinking that if he were to die, nobody was likely to write a work in memory of him, so he had better write one himself.
It is essentially a musical suicide note.
It is.
And the way he signs this note is just brilliant. He uses a musical motif based on his own name, which sounds impossible until you break down German musical notation. In that system, the note E-flat is pronounced E, and the note B natural is simply called H. So if you take his initials D, S, C, H and map them to those notes, playing D, E-flat, C, and B literally spells his name and sound.
And he weaves this DSCH motif obsessively all throughout the quartet.
It is like a prisoner carving their name deep into the stone of their cell so they won't be forgotten when they're gone.
That is a perfect way to put it. That four-note motif becomes a defining, haunting characteristic of his later work. He also heavily quotes his own past compositions in the eighth-string quartet, making it a literal musical autobiography of a broken man mourning his own legacy.
But as dark and heavy as this narrative is, the man himself wasn't just some brooding, monolithic monument of tragedy, was he? He was a deeply human bundle of contradictions and intense neuroses.
Oh, totally. The writer, Mikhail Zashenko, left a fascinating description of him. He called him frail, fragile, and a pure child, but simultaneously hard, acid, despotic, and incredibly intelligent.
Yeah, he had a face full of nervous gigs and grimaces. He was a relentless chain smoker until a severe heart attack forced him to quit. He was completely obsessed with cleanliness and order. He would meticulously synchronize all the clocks in his apartment. He even constantly mailed letters to himself just to test if the Soviet postal service was functioning properly.
Which is wild. But those quirks reveal so much about his deep-seated lack of trust in state systems and his desperate need to control his immediate environment.
Right.
But he also had wonderfully normal passions. He loved playing patience, and he was an absolutely massive association football fan.
He didn't just casually watch matches either. He was a fully qualified football referee.
I love that fact.
You can just imagine this brooding musical genius, the man who wrote the towering Leningrad Symphony, running down the pitch in shorts, blowing a whistle, and calling an onside penalty for his favorite team, Zenit Leningrad.
It completely grounds him, doesn't it? He was a real, flawed, passionate person trying to navigate an impossible reality. His later years were tragically marked by chronic, debilitating ill health, a rare form of poliomyelitis or motor neuron disease that ruined the use of his right hand, multiple heart attacks, and broken legs from frequent falls. He eventually passed away from lung cancer or heart failure in August 1975 at the age of 68.
Which brings us to the massive historical debate that exploded shortly after his death and really still rages in classical music circles today.
The testimony controversy.
Exactly. The controversy centers over a book published in 1979 called Testimony.
Right. Testimony was published in the West by a Soviet musicologist named Solomon Volkov, who had emigrated to the United States. Volkov claimed the book contained Shostakovich's smuggled memoirs, dictated directly to him during the composer's final years.
And this book presented a totally revisionist view of his life. It painted Shostakovich not as a loyal, fearful Soviet citizen who occasionally made ideological mistakes, but as a Eurodivy.
A traditional Russian holy fool.
Right. This cultural archetype of someone who outwardly conforms to the madness of the state, but secretly embeds covert anti-government dissidents into every single action and note they write.
And the debate over the authenticity of this book is fierce.
I bet.
Shostakovich's own children, Maxim and Galina, have largely supported Volkov's narrative over the years, stating it accurately reflects their father's true, hidden beliefs about the regime.
But on the other hand, rigorous scholars like Laurel Fay did intensive forensic work on the manuscript. She proved that the only pages of the testimony manuscript that Shostakovich actually signed were word-for-word reproductions of old, non-controversial essays and interviews he had already given to Soviet magazines years prior.
Meaning, Volkov likely recycled existing safe material to secure the composer's signature, and then heavily dramatized or fabricated the more explosive, distant quotes.
Wow. Okay, so where does that leave us?
Well, the scholarly consensus leans toward the book being highly questionable as a literal historical document, even if the emotional truth it presents resonates deeply with how his family and many listeners understood him.
That makes sense.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, regardless of the exact historical framing of that specific book, the legacy of the man remains untouched. Amidst the terrifying pressure of state demands, the mass suffering of his countrymen, and his own physical decline, he managed to forge a musical language of colossal emotional power.
He spoke for millions of people who literally could not speak for themselves.
Exactly.
And that leaves us with a lingering thought to carry forward. From the safety and comfort of the present day, it is incredibly easy for us to judge historical figures for not being braver.
Oh,
We
absolutely.
look back and criticize him for reading the scripted apology in New York, for signing the Communist Party card. We inherently want our historical heroes to stand up to the dictator, flip over the table, and yell, no.
But reality, especially under totalitarianism, is rarely that cinematic.
Shostakovich's life asks us to consider a completely different kind of bravery. The quiet, agonizing heroism of simply surviving. The strength it takes to swallow your pride, endure the humiliation, do whatever you have to do to keep your family from being sent to a labor camp, and hide your true soul inside the complex layers of a symphony orchestra.
Yeah.
He sat out by that elevator in the freezing dark so his children could sleep peacefully, trusting that if he could just stay alive, a future generation would come along, decipher the notes, and finally hear his true voice.